The night they forced her out of her own company, Evelyn Carter stood alone on a Chicago sidewalk, with no coat, no cab, and no one left to call. Everything she had spent 15 years building had collapsed in a single boardroom vote. She was not crying. She was just standing there in the cold, trying to remember what normal people did when everything was gone. A man she had never seen before slowed his truck and rolled down the window. She looked at him and said, the only thing that came to mind, "Can I stay with you? Just for tonight." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. That one decision changed everything. She had been the kind of woman who never stood still on a sidewalk. Evelyn Carter moved through rooms the way weather moves through open country, fast, certain, leaving a mark. For 15 years, she had run Arctis Solutions, from a corner office on the 32nd floor, managing a team of 240 people, closing deals that other executives wouldn't touch, building something from nothing with her own hands, and a stubbornness that her board had once called visionary. Tonight that same board had used a different word. They called it liability. The vote had been 4-1, her own company, her own people. She had sat at the head of that long glass table and listened to the motion pass like it was someone else's name being read aloud. The severance terms were laid out in a folder she didn't open. Her access card had been deactivated before she reached the elevator. By the time she stepped through the lobby doors and onto the street, her email was already locked. 15 years, and it took them less than 40 minutes to erase her. The wind off Lake Michigan cut straight through her blazer. She hadn't thought to grab her coat when they walked her out, and no one had offered to get it. Her phone was at 11%, and she had no charger, no destination, and no version of a next step that made any sense. She stood on the sidewalk and tried to think through it like a problem to be solved, which was the only way she knew how to think about anything. But the answers kept coming back empty, and the part of her brain that usually supplied the next move was just quiet, completely quiet. That scared her more than anything else. She had been standing there for close to 20 minutes when the truck slowed down. It was an older model, dark blue, the kind of vehicle that belonged to someone who used it for actual work. The man behind the wheel looked at her, the way people look at something that doesn't quite fit the scene, not with suspicion, but with a careful kind of attention. He rolled down the window and didn't say anything right away. She got there first. "Can I stay with you?" she said. "Just for tonight." She did not know why she said it. She had not planned to. She had never in her adult life asked a stranger for anything, let alone shelter. But the words came out flat and honest and completely without strategy, which was so unlike her that she almost didn't recognize her own voice. The man Daniel Hayes, though she didn't know his name yet, looked at her for a long moment. He was not a large man, not the imposing kind. He had the kind of face that had been through something and come out the other side without making a show of it. Steady, a little tired around the eyes, but not unkind. He looked at her, the way someone looks at a situation they're deciding whether to take on, and then he nodded once and unlocked the passenger door. She got in. She didn't ask where he lived. He didn't ask what had happened to her. They drove through the city in silence, and the silence was not uncomfortable in the way she expected. It was just quiet. The heater worked. That was enough. Daniel Hayes worked the overnight receiving shift at a distribution warehouse on the southwest side. He had held the same position for 6 years, the kind of job that paid steadily and asked nothing of you beyond showing up and doing the work correctly. He lived alone in a 2-bedroom apartment on the 2nd floor of a brick building that had been built sometime in the early 1980s, and he had made it livable the way men who live alone make things livable functionally, without much decoration, but with enough small habits that it felt like someone actually lived there. There was a coffee maker on the counter that he used every morning. There were books on the shelf that had actually been read. The place smelled like dish soap and something warm underneath it, like wood or old paper. Evelyn noticed all of this when he opened the door. She noticed it The way she noticed everything, cataloging, assessing, but nothing she observed made her want to leave. That surprised her. She had expected to feel the discomfort of downgrading the friction of a space that didn't match who she was. Instead, she just felt the cold leaving her shoulders, and she stood in the entryway and didn't move for a moment, because she wasn't sure what the protocol was, and that was an unusual feeling. Daniel set his keys on the hook by the door. He moved through his own space without ceremony, pulling a spare blanket from the closet and setting it on the couch along with a pillow. He filled a glass of water and put it on the coffee table. He did all of this without asking what she needed or what she preferred, which should have felt presumptuous, but somehow didn't. He was simply covering the basics, and the basics were exactly what she needed. "Bathroom's down the hall," he said. "There are clean towels under the sink." "Thank you," Evelyn said, and those two words cost her something. Not because she wasn't grateful, but because gratitude required acknowledging that she was in a position to need it. He nodded and went to the kitchen. She noticed a phone charger on the counter by the coffee maker and plugged her phone in without asking. It felt like the kind of household where that wouldn't require permission. She took off her heels the first time she had taken them off since 6 that morning and sat down on the couch with the blanket across her lap and tried to understand what had just happened to her life. The thing about Evelyn Carter was that she had always known exactly who she was. It had never been a question. She was the woman who stayed late, who read the fine print, who caught the number that didn't add up in a stack of 100 pages. That identity had not been something she chose so much as something she had built so carefully over so many years that it had become indistinguishable from her actual self. To be the CEO of Arctis Solutions was not what she did. It was what she was, and now that it had been taken, she sat in a stranger's apartment at 11:30 at night and found that the thing underneath the title was very quiet and very unfamiliar. She did not spiral. She was not a spiraling kind of person, but she sat with that quiet for longer than she was comfortable with. And when Daniel came back from the kitchen and set a bowl of pasta on the coffee table in front of her, plain with olive oil, nothing complicated, she looked at it and felt something tighten in her chest. Not because of the food, because someone had made it for her without being asked, without knowing who she was or what she had been, and had expected nothing in return. She ate. It was the first thing she had eaten since a working lunch at noon, and she ate all of it. "I'm Evelyn," she said when she put the bowl down. "Danielle," he said from the armchair across the room, where he was eating his own portion. That was all. They didn't talk about what had happened, or how she had ended up on that sidewalk. He didn't ask, and she didn't explain, and the absence of that conversation was the first real relief she had felt all night. She slept on the couch. It was not particularly comfortable. The cushions were firm, and the apartment made the small sounds that old buildings make, but she slept harder than she had in months, maybe longer. When she woke up, the light through the blinds was gray and early, and she could hear Daniel in the kitchen, the sound of the coffee maker running through its cycle. For a few seconds before she fully woke up, she didn't know where she was. And in those seconds, she felt nothing. No pressure, no agenda, no version of herself that she was supposed to perform. Just a woman on a couch in an unfamiliar room with coffee starting somewhere nearby. Then she remembered. All of it came back in the same flat sequence. The boardroom, the vote, the walk to the elevator, the street, the cold, the truck window rolling down. She lay there and let it settle over her, and she found that the feeling it produced wasn't panic and not grief. It was something closer to blankness, like a spreadsheet that had been cleared, but not yet deleted. She sat up, straightened the blanket and the pillow, and walked to the kitchen doorway. Daniel was standing at the counter with 2 mugs already poured. He handed her one without turning around, which meant he had heard her get up. She took it with both hands and stood in the doorway, and drank it, while he leaned against the counter and drank his, and neither of them said anything for a while. Outside, Chicago was starting. She could hear it, the low hum of traffic picking up a horn somewhere far off, the building's heat kicking on. A normal morning in a city that did not know or care what had happened to her last night. She stood there with her coffee and let that fact land, and something in the way it landed told her that the next chapter of her life was not going to look anything like the one she had just closed. She didn't know yet whether that was the worst thing that had ever happened to her or the beginning of something she didn't have a name for. She just knew she wasn't ready to leave. She had told herself it was temporary. One night, maybe two, until she figured out the next move. That was how she had always operated temporary states, as bridges to something more permanent, something controlled. But the days moved differently in Daniel's apartment. They moved slowly without agenda, and Evelyn found that she had no framework for that kind of time. She was used to a schedule that started before 6 in the morning and rarely released her before 9 at night. Back-to-back calls, decisions stacked on decisions, the constant low hum of something that needed her attention. Here, there was none of that. Daniel left for his shift in the late afternoon and came home before sunrise. The apartment was quiet for most of the day, and the quiet was not peaceful the way people described quiet when they were trying to sell you a vacation. It was disorienting. It pressed on her in a way she hadn't expected. She used her phone to follow the coverage, and there was coverage, because a CEO getting pushed out of a company she founded was the kind of story that the business press liked to run before the details were even confirmed. She read the headlines and felt a cold, detached recognition, like reading about someone she used to know. Then she put the phone face down on the coffee table and sat with her hands in her lap and realized she had nowhere to be and nothing that required her, and that feeling was so foreign she almost didn't have a word for it. She wasn't afraid. She was something worse. She was irrelevant. And she had never been irrelevant before in her adult life. Daniel didn't try to fix it. He didn't sit her down and walk her through her options or tell her it would get better. He didn't ask careful questions the way therapists do, or offer the kind of encouragement that people give when they're more afraid of your silence than you are. He just lived his life at the pace he always lived it, and let her exist alongside it without commentary. He cooked in the evenings before his shift. He read in the mornings when he got home. He kept the apartment clean in the specific way of someone who had learned that maintaining order in a small space was the easiest way to keep a clear head. Evelyn watched all of this without meaning to. She was a person who studied systems, and Daniel's life was a system, small, self-contained, and oddly efficient. Nothing in it was impressive by the standards she had spent her career operating under, but nothing in it was broken either. It worked. It held, and the more days she spent inside it, the harder it became to explain why her own life, with all its size and momentum, had felt so close to empty for so long. It was a Thursday evening, almost a week after she had first gotten into his truck, when the conversation happened. Daniel was getting ready to leave for work, and Evelyn was sitting at the kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee and the particular expression of someone who had been thinking too hard about the same thing for too long. He saw it and didn't ignore it, but he also didn't make it into something large. "You don't have to have it figured out yet," he said, pulling on his jacket. Evelyn looked up. "I'm not trying to figure anything out. You've been staring at that wall for 40 minutes, Daniel said. Not unkindly, just factual. She didn't have a response to that, which was unusual. She picked up the coffee cup, realized it was cold, and set it back down. "I keep thinking about what I'm supposed to do now. I know what the options are, I've run through all of them, but I can't figure out which one is actually mine." Daniel sat down across from her, which told her he had decided to be a few minutes late. He didn't do things carelessly, so the decision had weight. "What does that mean?" he said. "Actually yours." Evelyn thought about how to answer that. She was precise with language when it mattered, and this felt like it mattered. "I built that company," she said. Every system, every hire, every strategic decision for 15 years. And I thought that was me. I thought that was the thing I was. But when they took it, I waited to feel like myself again. She looked at the table. I'm still waiting. Daniel didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was level and without performance. I lost someone a few years ago, he said. Person I thought the whole thing was built around. When that was gone, I did the same thing. Waited to feel like myself. He rested his forearms on the table. Took me a long time to figure out that the self I was waiting for wasn't coming back. I had to find out what was actually left. Evelyn looked at him. He wasn't telling her the story to connect with her or to offer a lesson. He was just stating what had happened the same way he stated everything plainly without decoration. And somehow, that made it land harder than anything carefully constructed would have. What was left? She asked. Enough, Daniel said. Then he stood up, picked up his keys, and left for work. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time after that, not trying to solve anything, just sitting with the word. Enough. Something shifted after that conversation, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way that a room changes when someone opens a window. Evelyn stopped spending her days cataloging her options and started almost, without noticing, paying attention to what was directly in front of her. She started making the coffee in the mornings instead of waiting for it to be made. She cleaned up after herself with a thoroughness that went slightly beyond courtesy. Small things, but they were the first things she had done in over a week that weren't about managing her situation. They were just about the day, and what the day needed. She was not at peace. She was not recovered. But she was, for the first time since the boardroom actually present in the room she was standing in. The call came on a Saturday morning. The number was her former attorney's office, and she picked up because not picking up was also a choice with consequences, and she still thought in those terms. Marcus Webb, her corporate attorney, was calm and organized the way he always was, which meant the news he was delivering had been prepared. The board's vote, he explained, was being challenged by a minority shareholder group that believed the process had been procedurally compromised. There was legal standing. There was a case to be made. If she was willing to engage, there was a realistic path back to the table, and from the table potentially back to the chair at its head. Evelyn stood at the kitchen window while he talked. Outside, the neighborhood was doing what it did on Saturday mornings. Someone walking a dog, a couple of cars pulling out, nothing urgent. She listened to Marcus lay out the timeline and the strategy, and she recognized the shape of it, the way she recognized the shape of any deal. It was solid. It was achievable. It was, by every professional measure, the right move. How long do I have to decide? She asked. I need to file a response by end of next week, Marcus said. After that, the window closes. She told him she would call him back. She set the phone on the counter and stood at the window and felt the pull of it, the gravity of going back. She knew that world. She knew how to win in it. And there was a part of her, a part that had been trained for 15 years to want exactly this, that wanted it still. She didn't tell Daniel about the call right away. She carried it with her through the rest of the day, that familiar weight of a decision that hadn't been made yet. By the time he came home the next morning, she was already up and sitting at the kitchen table with a mug in both hands. He came and set his bag down, looked at her. Something happened, he said. My attorney called in C. Bonson, she said. There's a path back. Legal challenge, minority shareholders, the whole thing. It's real. Daniel went to the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water, came back and sat in the armchair. He didn't tell her what to do. He didn't look like he was about to. What do you want to do? He asked. The question was so direct that it caught her sideways. People in her world didn't ask what she wanted. They asked what she was going to do, which always assumed she already knew. I don't know, she said, and it was the first time she had said those 3 words out loud to another person in years. Yes, you do, Daniel said, not pushing, just stating it. And the thing was, she did. She had known since the moment Marcus started talking. She had known the way she knew things before she had language for them in the place where her instincts lived. Going back meant re-entering a structure that had already shown her exactly what it thought of her the moment she was no longer useful to it. Going back meant the 32nd floor and the back-to-back calls and the specific loneliness of being the most powerful person in a room full of people who needed something from her. Going back meant becoming again the woman who had stood on that sidewalk with 11% battery and no one to call. The pull of it was real, but what it was pulling her toward was not her life. It was the performance of her life. And she had spent 15 years in that performance and never once asked whether the audience was worth it. She called Marcus on Monday. She told him she was declining to pursue the challenge. He was professional about it, asked if she was certain, and when she said yes, he accepted it and moved on to the next item on his list, because that was what attorneys did. The call lasted 4 minutes. When she hung up, she expected to feel the collapse of it, the finality of a door closing on something that had taken her the better part of her adult life to build. She waited for the grief to arrive, but what arrived instead was something quieter and stranger. Not relief exactly, not joy, something closer to the feeling of setting down a weight you had been carrying so long you had stopped noticing how heavy it was, and then noticing only in the absence of it how much of your strength had been spent just holding on. She didn't have a plan. She didn't have a title or an office or a team or a role. She had a couch in a 2-bedroom apartment on the southwest side of Chicago, and a coffee maker she had started using every morning, and a conversation she kept returning to, the one that had ended with a single word. Enough. She had no idea what came next. And for the first time in 15 years, that uncertainty did not feel like a problem to be solved. It felt like a space. Open, uncomfortable, and entirely hers. The question she had been avoiding finally arrived on a Tuesday in the middle of washing dishes. She was standing at Daniel's kitchen sink, working through the breakfast things, and the question just came up through the quiet, the way things do when there's nothing left to drown them out. If she was not the CEO of Arctis Solutions, if she was not the woman who closed the deal, managed the team, held the whole structure together, then what exactly was she? Not who had she been? Who was she now in this kitchen, with soap on her hands, and no title, and no floor to stand on? She stood there with the water running, and let the question be as large as it actually was. She didn't try to answer it quickly. She had spent 15 years answering things quickly, and she was beginning to understand that the habit had cost her something she hadn't noticed losing. She had organized her entire sense of self around her function, around what she produced, what she controlled, how well she performed under pressure. Strip all of that away, and what remained was a woman standing at a sink in someone else's apartment, not entirely sure what she believed about herself when no one was measuring. She started cooking, not because it was therapeutic, and not because she was trying to contribute in some symbolic way. She started because the refrigerator had ingredients, and she knew how to use them, and it was something concrete she could do with her hands, while the rest of her figured itself out. She made dinner the first evening Daniel was home for it. Nothing complicated, just a proper meal with actual components, the kind of thing that required attention and timing, and enough focus to keep the other thoughts at a manageable distance. Daniel came to the kitchen doorway when he smelled it, and looked at the situation without comment. He set the table. They ate across from each other, the way they had eaten that first night, without much conversation. But the silence had a different quality now. It wasn't the silence of two strangers trying not to take up too much space. It was the silence of two people who had gotten comfortable enough not to fill every gap. "This is good," Daniel said about halfway through. "It's just chicken," Evelyn said. "Yeah," he said. "It's good, though." She ate her portion and thought that she had not received a compliment that straightforward in longer than she could place. In her previous life, approval had always come embedded in something else, a qualifier, a follow-up ask an agenda underneath it. This was just a man telling her the food was good because the food was good. It was almost disarming in its simplicity. She started going to the warehouse with him. Not every night, not in any official capacity. She just started coming along on the evenings when she couldn't sleep, and the apartment felt too still. She would sit in the break room with a cup of coffee from the machine that tasted like it had been brewed sometime in the previous decade, and she would watch the operation from the edges, the way goods moved through a system where the inefficiencies were where the process broke down, and the workers had developed their own workarounds to compensate. She wasn't evaluating it for a pitch deck. She wasn't building a case. She was just watching the way she had watched Daniel's apartment those first days, studying something because it was there, and because paying attention was the thing she did best, even when there was no return on it. But over the course of several nights, something started to form. Not ambition exactly. It didn't have that familiar sharpening quality. It was more like recognition. She could see a problem, a real one, and she understood with the specific clarity that had always been her actual gift, how it could be solved. The distribution center was losing hours to a receiving process that hadn't been updated in years. The workarounds the floor workers used were clever and completely undocumented, which meant every time someone left, the knowledge walked out with them. She had seen this pattern before in much larger companies, and she knew exactly what it cost over time. She also knew what it would take to fix it, not with a massive overhaul, but with a set of targeted practical changes that could be implemented without disrupting the existing workflow. She wrote it up over 3 evenings in the Notes app on her phone, in plain language, without any of the formal structure she would have used in a boardroom presentation. When she was done, she read it back and recognized that it was good. Not impressive good. There was a difference, and it was one she was only beginning to understand. She showed it to Daniel on a Thursday morning when he got home from his shift. He read it at the kitchen table with his coffee, taking his time, and then he looked up. "You wrote this for our floor?" he asked. "I wrote it because I could see the problem," Evelyn said. "What you do with it is your call." He read it again, then set the phone down. "I'll give it to the shift supervisor," he said. "He's been trying to make this case to management for 2 years. He'll know what to do with it." She nodded. That was enough. And she registered somewhere quiet inside her that a few weeks ago it would not have been enough, that a few weeks ago she would have needed to be the one to present it, to own it to get the credit. The fact that she could hand it to Daniel and mean it when she said the rest was his call, that was not a small thing. It was evidence of something changing that she didn't quite have a name for yet. The thing between her and Daniel was not named. They did not have a conversation about what it was or what it was becoming. It developed the way things develop when 2 people stop performing for each other and start simply being in the same space with some regularity. Gradually, then undeniably without a single moment, she could point to as the beginning. He had started leaving the second mug out before she asked. She had started knowing which shelf he kept things on, and she put things back in the right place without thinking about it. They talked in the mornings over coffee, with the particular ease of people who have already covered the difficult ground, and found they were still standing on the other side of it, not about the future, not about what anything meant, just about what was in front of them. The day, the weather, the small ordinary facts of 2 lives occupying the same square footage. One evening she came back from a long walk. She had started taking those walking without a destination, which was another thing she had never done before, and found a book on the coffee table with a sticky note that said she might like it. She picked it up, read the back, sat down, and started it, before she even took off her coat. She was 3 chapters in before she realized she had been smiling at the page. She had no memory of the last time she had smiled at a page. He came home the next morning, and she told him she was already halfway through. He looked at her, the way he sometimes looked at her carefully without comment, then poured his coffee, and sat down, and asked what she thought of the second chapter. They talked about the book for 40 minutes. It was, without qualification, one of the better conversations she'd had in recent memory. That fact didn't escape her. She found an apartment of her own at the end of the following month. A 1-bedroom, 3 neighborhoods, over modest and clean with enough light that she thought she could make it livable. She signed the lease on a Wednesday and told Daniel that evening. He nodded and said that was good, and she believed him when he said it, because he was not the kind of person who said things he didn't mean. She moved in with very little. The things from her old life were still in storage, boxed up and waiting for a version of her that no longer quite existed. She bought a coffee maker first, then a good lamp, then a set of dishes she chose because she liked them, not because they were the right thing to have. The apartment was quiet in a way that was different from Daniel's quiet, because it was her quiet now, and she was a different person standing in it than the woman who had stood on that sidewalk 6 weeks before. She called him on the 3rd night after she had gotten the kitchen set up and the books she had bought in the past few weeks arranged on a shelf by the window. He picked up on the 2nd ring. "How is it?" he asked. "Quiet," she said. "Good quiet." "Yeah," he said. "Those are different." They were on the phone for almost an hour. When she hung up, she sat in the particular stillness of a space that was entirely hers, and felt for the first time in as long as she could recall like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not at a destination she was not naive enough to think she had arrived anywhere, but in motion toward something real, something she had chosen, something that belonged to her in a way that a title and a corner office and a team of 240 people never quite had. There was a night not long after she moved in when she sat by the window with the book Daniel had recommended and a cup of coffee she had made herself and watched the city doing what cities do in the evening lights, coming on people moving through the frame of the street below the ordinary ongoing fact of other lives. She thought about the boardroom. She thought about the cold of the sidewalk and the truck window rolling down and the question she had asked a stranger because it was the only honest thing she had left. She thought about a quiet apartment on the southwest side and a man who had opened a door without asking for an explanation, and the word he had used when she asked him what was left after everything that mattered had gone. Enough. She understood it now, in a way she hadn't then. Enough was not a consolation prize. It was not what you settled for when you failed to get more. Enough was the thing you had when you stopped measuring your life against a standard that had never actually been yours, when you took what was real and what was present and let it be sufficient without requiring it to be spectacular. She had spent 15 years chasing something larger than enough, and she had gotten it, and it had voted her out 4-1 and deactivated her keycard before she reached the elevator. What she had now was smaller by every metric she had previously used. It was also without question more hers. She set the book down on the windowsill and looked out at the city and felt something she didn't try to name, because naming it would have meant managing it, and she was done managing things that were fine on their own. She just let it be there, that quiet, settled, unspectacular feeling of a woman who had finally stopped waiting to become someone else and started slowly and without fanfare becoming herself.